listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this is the final of our current run until the summer. I think I'm going to take a break, as I usually do most years, because I'm going on holiday in a couple of weeks, and then obviously it's relatively quiet, certainly here in the UK over August, so I'll take the opportunity for a bit of a break to focus on some other things, mostly trying to recharge my batteries, which I hope you're all going to manage to do as well. And then we'll return in the autumn with a whole new slew of episodes and interviews. But for this final episode, we have one final great interview for this current run. And this one is with Pamala Wiepking. Now, those of you who religiously listen to every episode of this podcast may recognise Pamela's name, as she was on an earlier episode at the start of the year, one of the episodes that we do in partnership with the European Research Network on Philanthropy, or EarnUp. And Pamela was on that with one of her colleagues, Arjen de Wit, talking about some work that they had done looking at the theoretical benefits of unrestricted funding. But I mentioned at that point that I was quite keen at some point to get Pamela on by herself to talk about some of her wider work. She does all kinds of things, as I'm sure you'll hear in a moment. And I made good on that promise, or threat, as you might think of it. And I sat down with Pamela a couple of weeks ago to talk with her, particularly about work that she has been doing for a while and is doing now on trying to broaden our understanding of generosity at a global scale. So I should say, so just in terms of who Pamela is. So Pamela, she's the inaugural Stead Family Chair in International Philanthropy at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in Indiana in the US, which is probably most relevant to what we're talking about in the interview that you're about to hear. But she's also a professor of the societal significance of charitable lotteries at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So she does all kinds of interesting things to do with philanthropy. And as I say, we sat down for a conversation that was mostly focused on the whole question of understanding generosity, I guess, and you'll see why I shift towards that terminology in a moment, at a global level. So we talked, to start with, about the whole question of whether philanthropy is actually useful as a word, or whether when you're broadening out beyond certainly the US and the UK, it's actually quite problematic or kind of presents a barrier to understanding what we're talking about. If it is a barrier or if it's not helpful, why is that? Is it that people just don't understand it, or is it that they do understand it but that it brings particular connotations or implications with it that aren't helpful? And then we talked about, well, what do you do instead? Do you broaden the definition of philanthropy to encompass more things, or do you sort of keep philanthropy for a subset of some wider concept such as generosity? And if you do that, what subset of that overall activity are we talking about when we talk about philanthropy, and is it useful to do that? And we talked a bit about why it's necessary, I think, at this point in time to try and broaden our understanding of generosity beyond perhaps what we've traditionally thought of as philanthropy or charity. We talked about the extent to which that forces you to confront other traditions and ideas of giving and generosity that are focused more on concepts of mutualism, reciprocity, solidarity, rather than perhaps charity or altruism, and whether that is a good thing, or whether there is a need to distinguish between those two things, and that if you blur the distinctions, whether that starts to confuse things. And we also talked, I guess, on that note about whether in this drive to broaden our definitions of generosity, there's a danger of going too far and making those concepts nebulous, so that it's kind of encompasses almost everything, and then it becomes difficult to determine whether or not you actually know what you're talking about. We talked about whether, in trying to understand some of those sort of broader ideas of generosity, and particularly how those are reflected in other cultures around the world outside of the US and the UK or the global north, part of what's required is to kind of decolonize philanthropy research itself, so that rather than researchers from a kind of Western global North background trying to change the way that they think or perceive things in order to understand other cultures. It would be more helpful to encourage research from researchers that actually come from those other countries and cultures, so that they can bring a diversity of perspectives to academic research. We talked a bit on that note, actually, about whether the role of academics when it comes to philanthropy is simply to observe and analyse and report, or whether they can see part of their role as actively trying to encourage people to give more, or to be more generous, or to give in particular ways, which I thought was kind of interesting, because as you'll hear, Pamela talks at some points about the fact that her work, she feels, is kind of part of a wider mission that she has in her life, which I'm sure is true for many people. And sometimes that kind of tension between the objectivity that's demanded of academics and that desire to have an impact in the world can be quite an interesting one. And then we talked a bit about the question of measuring generosity, and we talked about whether the current measures that we use to measure generosity and giving behaviour within countries, but certainly at a global level, are inadequate, and if so, why, and what we should make of sort of efforts to kind of move beyond some of those measures. And related to that, we touched quite a bit on the question of how we should understand the claims that are made at the moment that there is a sort of fundamental decline in giving in some places, certainly the US and the UK, the Netherlands, Canada and others, so certainly in some countries in the global north, and whether that genuinely reflects a decline in generosity, or whether it reflects the fact that generosity is continuing at the same levels or maybe even increased levels, but in ways that are not being captured by the measures that we have sort of traditionally chosen to apply. So without further ado, let's get into that conversation, because I've got overexcited in the summary and probably gone on a bit there. So you'll hear from Pamela and I now, and then I will be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Pamala Wiepking. Hi there, Pamela.
Hey, Rodri.
It's really great to have a chance to talk. I know you were on briefly on an episode a little while ago as one of the Earn Up Research Notes series, talking about some work you were doing on core cost funding. But I was very keen to get you back on to have a chance to talk much more broadly, because you do lots of really, really interesting things. What we were planning on talking about today is something that's been a big part of your work for a long time now, which is trying to look at the whole question of generosity and giving and understand it in a much more global sense, and perhaps get away from the kind of narrow focus on the UK and the US and the global north that we've maybe had historically. Maybe a good starting point would be for you just to say a bit about how your interest in that particular question came about and how it led to the work you're doing, particularly with the Stead Chair that you've got at the moment at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy.
Yeah, thanks so much. I've been working on global philanthropy, I think, since 2009. And the reason is why I started doing that was actually pretty instrumental. I was writing a grant proposal to the Dutch Science Foundation, and I thought, what is the thing I think we need to study in philanthropy? What do I think may blow them away? What will they fund me to do? And I thought, well, there's great work on global philanthropy, civil society by Salomon Anheier and but there's so much we don't know yet. So in 2009, I wrote this grant proposal about global generosity, and it got funded. So I had 4 years of my own time funded to study this topic. And then I met Famida Hendy at a conference in Chicago, and I started to explain what I was trying to do, because as often in my work, I envision pretty big projects that turn out to be more challenging than I initially anticipated. And in this case, I was trying to edit a book with people from all across the world that would write about their own global civil society in their own location. And at the time, we called it nonprofit sector, because I was pretty ignorant about that a lot of countries don't actually have a nonprofit sector. So showing my white Western bias there already, which we'll probably continue to hear about a lot through this interview, because there's so much we don't know, because it isn't written about. We don't know how other people in other countries talk about generosity, philanthropy, civil society often. So I wanted to do this edited volume, but I struggled as a new assistant professor to get all the people to work with me voluntarily because I didn't have any funding for them to work with me. And for me, they said, well, I'm really interested in this project and I'm happy to work with you as a co-editor. And it turned out that that was a wonderful proposal because became a great team and we've been working ever since. But this became the Palgrave Handbook of Global Philanthropy. And there we have 26 context areas, countries represented. And what I found really important is that researchers wrote about their own context. It was not us writing about their context, but people wrote about their own context. And we've given them a pretty strict format to do so, which again is something I would not do again that way, learning what I've learned over the years. But for example, we got quite a bit of pushback from one of the authors, Dana Doan, who later became a PhD student at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and she's just graduated. And I'm really excited to see what she will do next in the world. But she was living in Vietnam, and she had been living there for a long time, and she was working with a local collaborator. And she provided pushback on using this nonprofit sector terminology. She said, it's not valid in Vietnam. You need to talk about these things in different ways here. And that's what I'm trying to do now in my work. I'm trying to listen much better to people who have experience and knowledge about local context and try to integrate it in the research we do in a way that it is inclusive of all those voices.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I really want to dig into particularly something you touched on there, which is I think that challenge of broadening out our conception of generosity so that it kind of recognizes and respects the fact that there are so many different rich cultures of it around the world, but also trying to kind of keep some common core so that you can compare between different places and have a kind of conceptual framework. And you know, that feels like it's the kind of key challenge. But I guess before we come to that, I wanted to ask something quite specific. You mentioned there, obviously, in terms of the handbook that you worked on, it's the Handbook of Global Philanthropy. Obviously, the word philanthropy is in there, as it is in the title of, you know, this podcast and many kind of schools and academic centres, you know, in the UK and elsewhere. But when you're looking at generosity in a global context, is it actually helpful to use the word philanthropy? I mean, does it act as a kind of, you know, is it some sort of lingua franca? Does it resonate? Or is it something that either people in other countries don't really understand or don't recognise? Or does it kind of have particular connotations for them that maybe aren't so helpful?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I'm conducting research with some of the students at the PhD students at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, including Anastasia Okome and Kitty Yassin. And we have done quite a lot of qualitative work now, try to understand how people across the world, how they look at philanthropy, what they mean when they use that word. And the common thing we find is outside of English-speaking contexts, especially outside of the US and the UK, people don't know the word. That's the predominant thing we find. But if they do know the word, in the most positive sense, they would talk about philanthropy as something that is formalized giving to organizations to address structural, bigger issues in society. I really liked what one respondent in the interview study said is philanthropy is the big word for generosity. It addresses problems in a more structural and organized way. And I think that definition of philanthropy can certainly play a role. But for a lot of other people, when they did know the word philanthropy, they would talk about rich white men in the US giving lots of money. That is the way they look at philanthropy. So it has a very negative connotation for a lot of people, and they don't see themselves as philanthropists.
It's really interesting because it feels like, particularly in the US at the moment, there's quite a big debate and a push in a way to kind of reclaim the word philanthropy, you know, and its original meaning as a love of humanity, and allow a broader definition that encompasses not just giving money, but giving all kinds of resources and at all sorts of different levels. Do you think that's the right approach in a way, is to try and kind of broaden the definition of philanthropy so that we all have a richer understanding? Or actually, is it about accepting other terminology as well and then kind of working out how that fits around philanthropy? I sort of wonder, I can't make my own mind up about which way is best to go on that.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two camps, at least on the academics on this. I've had this discussion many, many times. And a lot of my academic friends say, no, we have to stick with philanthropy. That is the word we've been using. We just need to make sure people understand what we mean by it, that it is this love of mankind. But what I would say is that for a lot of people across the world, philanthropy doesn't have that meaning, that doesn't have that connotation. But generosity does. Like when we ask people about when they think about generosity in their own local languages, translations of it, they come up with very clear definitions. They understand what that is. And I really like this definition that is of generosity that's provided by the Science of Generosity Initiative. And they say generosity is giving good things to others freely and abundantly. And what exactly generosity gives can be various things: money, possessions, time, attention, aid, encouragement, emotional availability, and much more. So it's this very inclusive and broad definition of behavior that people do to benefit others. And that's another way you can talk about it. Behavior expressed to benefit others. I think that can be very helpful.
And if we think about it in that sense, would it be fair to say that the relationship is something like, generosity can and maybe often is something that leads to philanthropy or drives philanthropy, although maybe it's not entirely kind of coextensive with it, because also that, have to be realistic that there is some philanthropy that maybe isn't driven entirely by generosity. So there's definitely a strong relationship between the two. But if you differentiate, actually they're kind of this Venn diagram, but it's not one, where the two circles are entirely overlapping.
Yeah, I really like the way you put this. And I think philanthropy is oftentimes much more institutionalized. It is focused at the larger issues in societies, trying to address systemic change. While generosity, it is also being perceived as being more communal, being locally focused, being with the people that are around you, focused on them. And that can include, for example, family, because one of the things we are excluding often from our definition of philanthropy when we measure it is giving to kin. But in a lot of contexts, that is what people do when they display generosity behavior, because they have this local informal help networks where that is how they support others. There are no formal nonprofit organizations they give money to, but they have this really intricate local social systems where people support each other. And I would say, whether you use generosity or philanthropy, I think we should include that in measurements, because currently we're not doing that. And that is discounting the behavior of a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that brings us back to that point of when you start looking globally, and even, to be honest, I guess when you start looking within countries like the US and think more broadly than just philanthropy as giving to organizations within a formalized non-profit sector. Actually, there's all kinds of other generosity behaviors that you can find. What then becomes the challenge of deciding how far you enlarge the tent to allow all of those things in so that you have a richer understanding, but don't allow it to become so broad that there's a danger that it becomes a bit amorphous and you've kind of included everything and it's sort of hard to have any conceptual center to it.
Yeah, no, I think that is a challenge. And I'm thinking about this a lot. And I know other people are thinking about it, thankfully. But what I think is the real challenge here is to operationalize it, to try to measure this conceptual definition of generosity. And how I see this now, but it's constantly changing. But one of the things I'm thinking, there could be dimensions of generosity behavior. And then you could measure those different dimensions across different cultural contexts. And these dimensions could, for example, be whether the behavior is targeted at formal or informal institutions or people, whether it is targeted at people you know or people you don't know. What forms do these behaviors take? Money, possessions, time, aid, encouragement, but also the things we typically don't measure in Western contexts. For example, my colleague Sharik Siddiqui has co-edited the book with David Campbell on philanthropy in Muslim countries. And one of the big things he mentions is that what is important in Islam is inaction, not doing anything, because it could cause harm. So this could be something also you include in a dimension measuring or generosity. So I have to do a lot more thinking about this, and I'd love to hear from people if they have other ideas about it. But what I think this could lead to is a so-called generosity profile. For different cultures, you could have different elements of those dimensions that are most prominent in those countries. And that could possibly move us away from those indices that measure the most generous country in the world, but a much more nuanced understanding of in what way do people behave generously, and also maybe look more at the outcomes of that. So what are the intended outcomes?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And particularly, I'd never thought of that idea of kind of inaction as a form of action or sort of philanthropy. I think that's really, really interesting. And I guess you bring in there the question of measurement, which I think is really interesting and important in here. I mean, to what extent is the current state of our understanding, but the understanding that is centered at the moment in kind of academic institutions in the global north of generosity, to what extent has that been shaped by the things that we have decided that we want to measure? Is that part of the problem, that kind of previous efforts to measure generosity have kind of approached it with a set of tools and frameworks and metrics that have already kind of decided what the elements of generosity are and are only going out looking for those, and so they understandably have kind of missed all kinds of other activity?
Yeah, well, and I understand why that happens, because as part of this global philanthropy project that I started in 2009, what I also wanted to do is bring together all different types of data sources measuring giving. So in different countries, we have the Giving in the Netherlands panel study, you have data in the UK, in the US, but also many other countries. And what I wanted to do is synchronize those data sets so that you can actually measure, like have an understanding of how many people are giving in a country and how much are they giving, because that is something we often miss, and then see what explains that. Well, I would consider that a complete failed attempt, what I did. And I learned a lot from that. But those data sets were just so different. So it was really hard to make them comparable. And we've published some with it, but it's also very old data. When we started doing this was already data from the early 2000s, and now it's completely old. No, it is not something you can do with it. And I think the other global initiatives there are to measure generosity or philanthropy are suffering from same problems. There's just not enough funding to really in depth explore what generosity is across all those countries. And then you end up with a very simplistic measure. So, for example, the Gallup poll measures, did someone volunteer for a nonprofit organization in the month before the question is asked? Did they donate to an organization? And did they help a stranger? So I really like that last question, that it's in there, because it gives some form of informal behavior, but still it's just this one incident question that doesn't tell you a lot, especially because there's a lot of difference across people, whether they report these types of behavior and whether there's opportunity for these people to display, for example, the formal giving and volunteering behavior. So it makes it really challenging to compare those statistics then. So until we have anything better, this is what we have. But what I learned from my failed attempt to gather all those data sets and combine them is that I won't embark on a project trying to measure this inclusively in a more quantitative way until I have a lot of funding. Because only if you have a few million, you will be able to do it correctly. But otherwise, you will still make a lot of mistakes and assumptions. And then I think it's not worth all the efforts that we would put into it.
And is one, it strikes me, you mentioned there some of the kind of existing efforts to measure generosity within countries, but also then kind of comparatively across different countries, and having, without getting sort of too much into the detail of it here, I guess one of the things from having done a little bit of this myself in the past that I think is it feels like there's a real challenge, because not just the choice of methodology, so whether you go for, surveying people about their own behaviour, which obviously brings its own challenges, or you look at the money from the receipts of non-profit organisations themselves, but then obviously you're immediately looking at the formalised sector, or whether you go through the tax system. But all of that reflects to some extent how giving works in that particular country. So, for instance, the methodology of Giving USA, or at least part of it that relies on information through tax returns, wouldn't work at all in the UK, because the tax system for giving works totally differently. Do those kind of country-specific issues to do with the nature of the sector and the way that tax incentives for giving work, does that present a real challenge in terms of thinking about how you might get some sort of consistent methodology across different places?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Another example that I always find really interesting, my Dutch, so I work at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy as the Stead Family Chair in International Philanthropy, where I do most of the research we're talking about today. But I also hold a 1-day-a-week position as a full professor of the societal significance of charity lotteries at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And there I'm part of the center that conducts Giving in the Netherlands study, which we just launched last week, which was an exciting event. But I'm mentioning this because charity lotteries are a huge funder in the Netherlands. But in a lot of countries, and especially the US, for example, they have never heard of charity lotteries. They think, what is that? So when a US researcher wants to measure, for example, philanthropic contributions across the world, they will never think to measure the contributions of charity lotteries. Well, in the Netherlands, they're one of the biggest funders. So that just to say, like, if you're not from a local context, you wouldn't know what is important and what is going on. And of course, you can study that. And one initiative I really appreciate, and I'm part of the board at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, is the Global Philanthropy Indices. And there we're trying to really understand, or I'm saying we, but all the wonderful researchers working on the project, I'm just advising at some points. They're trying to understand the philanthropic context in which are present in the organization. And also looking at, for example, the tax incentives and cross-border giving, which is an important aspect there. So there are definitely initiatives that are trying to increase this understanding, and there are local networks, for example, in Africa and in Asia, that are trying to do the same thing. But yeah, it's very challenging because it is so dependent on the context. But I'm a sociologist, so actually I like that a lot because I think context is everything.
Yeah, and that's I guess for all of us what keeps us interested in philanthropy, is it? It's annoyingly complex, but it's also fascinatingly complex. So I guess just one final question on this, which is sort of, related to what we've already been talking about. But in terms of deciding where, if anywhere, you would draw the boundaries around what you would want to count as generosity or giving. I guess part of this whole narrative at the moment is that, to some extent we need to not be quite as normative, not sort of turn up saying, well, these are the only categories that count and anything else that falls outside this is, doesn't count, and slightly be more descriptive or go along with what, people within other countries and communities themselves consider, generosity and giving behaviour. Are there any points at which you would draw boundaries around that, or say, even if people themselves, consider something as giving, actually, as a researcher or an academic, you might want to challenge it or distinguish between it? I'm thinking here of things like political giving, where from the point of view of an individual, they might make no distinction between giving that they're doing towards a non-profit and giving that they're doing that is much more political in nature. But it might be useful as a researcher or an academic to have some sort of distinction between those two things.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. You make really important points. What I would advocate is that we measure the full spectrum. We measure everything that we can think of that may be relevant for people in some cultures. But then as a researcher, you can decide what your definition is, what you want to study. But I think by limiting the research on just what we in advance normatively determine what is philanthropy or generosity, we're missing parts of the picture that you may want to include. And I think it's especially important for something you mentioned earlier, is that even in the US and the UK and the Netherlands, there's a lot of informal behavior going on. That Tyrone Freeman, another colleague at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, is really advocating that we also include Black Americans' ideas about generosity and philanthropy in our definitions, and because they're currently not measured. And we have seen during the pandemic that a lot of informal groups stood up trying to help and support the people that were in need. Like mutual aid became really important during the pandemic. And one of the students I work with, we have a professional PhD at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy since a year now. And I'm the chair of Shelly Tekirski, and she started Pandemic of Love. And what she's trying to do is trying to formalize mutual aid groups so that they're no longer punished for helping others, giving groceries, for example, or taxed for doing things that they're trying to do through mutual aid. So that's just one of the examples of the professional PhD cohort that we have. They're doing amazing things. But I really think that we should be thinking more about this inclusive measurement, capturing the whole circle of what people across cultures would think is included in generosity behavior that benefits others. And then as a researcher, be very critical about it. Do I think that is philanthropy or generosity? Or is it just to benefit someone's own agenda?
As well, I guess, as the measures that we use, or that academics based in centres in the global north use. One of the things that I know you've written about before is that an important part of this is making more of a concerted effort to decolonise philanthropy research itself. Maybe you could say a bit about that. I mean, is what you mean by that actually, as well as just being more open when seeing people as research subjects in other countries and taking into account their points of view about what generosity is it about supporting more researchers and academics from other countries who can themselves kind of bring to bear those different conceptions of generosity?
Yeah, I think for me that's the last thing is a big point, because there is so many scholars or students that are underfunded, working in contexts that we rarely study, and funding is a huge issue there, and funding is distributed so unequally. So if those scholars and students would get better funding, better educational programs, access to those, that would mean a lot, and it would change a lot in the way we would be talking about these measurements. And we as Western people, or I like to use the term weird from Joe Henry, Western, educated, industrialized, democratic, and rich. People from those countries, we're a minority in the world, but we dominate academic debate and maybe a lot of other debates. But this is what I know for sure. We dominate the academic debate on philanthropy. And I would really want us to help fund scholars that have different voices and that have different ideas to bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really important part of all of this. And I guess one thing I wanted to ask you, kind of a slightly wider question beyond that, it feels as though certainly in your work, there is an element of it where it is clearly, it's academic work. You have the point of view of an academic, of a researcher, and you're trying to kind of understand global generosity in a broader sense. But it also feels at times as if you see part of your role as advocating beyond that. So it's not just dispassionate analysis and kind of, cold objective observation. You genuinely want to use that information to try and encourage more generosity, or to sort of, expand other people's understanding of generosity. Do you feel as though those two things are part of what you're trying to do in your work?
Yeah, I think for me, my academic work is a means towards my mission. And it's my mission to help create more generous societies where people care for each other and want to contribute to the public good rather than take from it. And I'm not sure whether I'm actually making a dent into this mission. I came up with this mission when I was working at a very negative institutional environment where there was a lot of pressure on me to publish work that I did not care about, that I thought was meaningless. And then I thought, so I don't want to spend the rest of my career working on things that are meaningless to me, and I think to a large part of the world, like those highly ranked academic journal articles that 5 people read, but will save your career. Because I've been in a very, like many other academics in philanthropy, I've been in very insecure job positions for a very long period of my life. I just only in 2018, when I joined the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, that became more secure, and now I have this full professorship in Amsterdam. But like for 18 years of my career, I was just on temporary contracts and just trying to survive as an academic, which I know many others are. And I just want to tell to those people, this is not about your drivenness, your talent, your aspiration, your inspiration. This is just about the academic institutions that don't fund you, and it's not about you. So, but yeah. So I want to change the world in a way, and I know I'm realistic that I won't have a lot of impact, but I really want to try to have impact. And I think in my role as an academic, I can have most impact. So oftentimes I wonder, if I really want to achieve this mission, should I not become foundation director? Or should I go into politics? Or should I? But I think in this role, I have most influence and can achieve most. But at the same time, these roles also come with a lot of responsibilities and tasks that do not necessarily contribute to this mission. And that is where I sometimes then struggle. But I think every job, every position comes with a lot of things that may seem less meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that question lots of people I speak to in the philanthropy world, whichever point in that ecosystem you choose to be in because you feel that, you know, that's where you can do the most good. The reality always is then that there are lots of things that take up your time that feel like they're not doing that work, and whether that's, you know, as a foundation director, it's just the management of an institution, or whether you're in a frontline organisation and you're having to spend an enormous amount of your time on fundraising rather than operations. And I think, you know, as you say, for anyone who chooses to focus their efforts on research or academia, there's definitely a benefit to that, but the difficulty with anything that is that sort of far upstream is it can feel quite removed from the change that you want to see in the world. So kind of as you were saying to me just before we came on the call, sometimes actually the good thing to do is to make lists of things that you've actually done rather than lists of things that you've got to do, which I think is a great idea, because it does sort of remind you that you are having an impact. I wanted to ask actually, because we mentioned at the start of the conversation a bit about giving in the USA, and you mentioned in the course of that your involvement in the Giving in the Netherlands research that's just come out, and Giving USA, as we record this, just was released yesterday. Both of those pieces of research and other pieces of research about generosity, particularly in global north countries at the moment, have consistently over the last few years suggested that there is a decline in giving, both in terms of overall top line levels of giving when adjusted for inflation, and in some cases in terms of levels of participation in giving. What's your sense of those findings? I guess both, you know, do you think there is a genuine trend there? Is it something that concerns you? How should we be interpreting it?
Yeah, no, so first of all, I only play a very, very small part in the Giving in the Netherlands study, and I want to give all the kudos to the team doing that, led by René Bekkers and Stephanie Maas and Malou Ramakers. But I am very concerned about this declining trend, especially in giving among everyday donors. It is the foundation for the legitimacy of philanthropy or generosity, if you look at it in terms of formal giving. I don't see this trend changing unless there is a different approach in the nonprofit sector. And at the same time, I also think because we measure only this small aspect, the formal aspect of what people do, I think we're missing a lot of what people actually are contributing to others and to the public good. And I would be really interested to see if those behaviors are also declining. And I'm not sure about that. I think actually a lot of people are doing a lot of things to help each other and support each other. But yeah, for the decline in formal giving is worrisome, because especially because this decline is partly driven by decline in religiosity. And in countries with weak welfare states, where the religious organizations are taking care of those overlooked in societies, the homeless people, immigrants, people without documents, if these organizations are not properly funded, this will have direct consequences for the lives of those people and how well they be able to live, or whether they actually will be able to live. It's just very worrisome if you think about it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember a couple of years back now having a conversation on this podcast with one of your colleagues at the Lilly Family School, actually, David King, about faith and philanthropy. And we were talking precisely about this. And I guess that question of whether the problem with the decline in religiosity and its impact on giving was about the fact that is somewhere where people get brought up with the relevant kind of teachings about the importance of giving, or whether it's other things like the more practical reality of going to a place of worship every week, and that being somewhere that... And so again, as you say, once you dig into it, it'd be really interesting to unpick what it is about these different factors that are having an impact. On the point you made there as well, you linked it back, I think, quite neatly to what we've been talking about already, about broadening that definition of generosity. Again, it's something that I've heard from various people, and again on the podcast, one of the earliest episodes of this podcast, I spoke to Lucy Bernholtz about her work in her book How We Give Now, and one of her contentions and other people's is that actually maybe this is more about the fact that giving and generosity is evolving into different forms in places like the US, and we're just failing to keep pace in terms of the way that we measure giving. Do you have any sense of, as you've said there, do you think that is part of the story, and actually what we need to be doing here is not thinking that this is a decline in generosity as a whole, but it's maybe just that it's shifting forms from ones that we traditionally have decided to capture to other forms. And so actually it's more important than ever that we broaden out our understanding and our measures.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the last point. We need to broaden our understanding of generosity or philanthropy behavior. But I think the problem is because we haven't been measuring those more informal ways of giving in the US or the Netherlands, or probably also not the UK, we won't know whether there's actually an increase in that behavior or whether it's been there all, because that's what Tyrone Freeman says. Like, in the Black community, it has been there all the time. It hasn't declined. It's still there. So we would not know, but I think we need to start somewhere, and let's capture everything and see where we go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to come back, I guess, to the work that you're doing and continuing to do on sort of on global giving and understanding different cultures of generosity, and to think a bit about what the relevance of that and the sort of practical implications might be for people working within philanthropy, whether that's, foundations or fundraisers or people working in non-profits. To what extent do you think, beyond academic interest, there is value in understanding different cultures of generosity? Do you think that for someone working in a non-profit in the US or the UK or in Europe, that actually understanding how different types of giving work in Africa or Southeast Asia or other places, does it genuinely have value that they can bring to their work? And what kind of insights do you think they could get from it?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And what really encouraged me was when we published the Belgrade Handbook of Global Philanthropy. Famida and Hendy and I got a lot of emails from people across the world, also the Western or weird world, where people said that they were so interested to finally better be able to understand how the nonprofit sector worked in all those other countries. So I think there's a genuine interest, and I think we can learn a lot from each other in both ways. So I'm currently conducting focus groups with fundraisers in different countries, together with Akash Kutab and Cassandra Chapman from the University of Queensland. And this is in a larger project on donor motivations, but we wanted to see whether the motivations we found in the literature actually resonate with fundraisers across different contexts. And what is really interesting is one of the outcomes, for example, of a focus group we did earlier this week in the Arab world, is that those fundraisers were very, very experienced fundraisers. And they said, we've seen this region change the past 20 years. It's become so much more formalized and so much more institutionalized, and corporate giving has grown so much. And so I think there's all those different trends across the world. Like you see there, it becomes much more formalized. Well, we see here, we start to pay much more attention to the informal ways that we're giving. So I think we can all learn a lot from how civil society is organized. And if people can join me in this aim to create these more generous societies, that is what we can learn from it. Like, by not having policies that do not resonate with the local context. Like a lot of the policies around philanthropy, if there are any policies, they're imported from the US, or they're just like they're not context specific enough. Or when we teach fundraising, we use a lot of the US literature, but it doesn't work the same across all countries, what we're also trying to show with this study. So yes, I think we can learn a lot from this.
And you mentioned there, I guess, the possibility of policies that are implemented within particular countries to incentivize philanthropy and giving. And I guess that is one of the levels at which you could take action on this. And I guess just to unpick that a bit more, I mean, you made the point there that where those policies just kind of import ideas directly from the US or UK or other places and don't kind of give enough thought to the specific context, that doesn't tend to work very well. Do you think part of that actually is that those policy mechanisms in other places need to think about encompassing other forms of generosity or kind of social action that maybe aren't currently reflected in places like the US or the UK? And I guess conversely, if we're now talking in places like the US and the UK about broadening our understanding of what counts as generosity, should we start thinking about expanding the mechanisms that we currently have to cover other things? Like, should tax incentives cover other forms of giving that aren't just, giving as we currently understand it in a formal way to registered non-profit institutions?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think you're more an expert on policy than I am. So probably you can say much more interesting or relevant things about this than I can. But I do see policy as the key thing we can use to change the world. And we are not using it in any way we could or should, I think. And I think partly that's a lack of education on what philanthropy is in a lot of contexts. So policymakers don't know what philanthropy is. They don't see the value. It is this interesting niche thing in society. And oh, how wonderful, people do good. Yay! And let's move on. And I think if we can educate people better, and including the policymakers, but also people in the nonprofit sector, because in a lot of countries, there are just no strong educational university level programs around philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. And I think that could make a huge difference if people better understand what the power of our sector is and what our sector can do. And rather than just continue the way we've been working in this sector for a very long time, because I really feel that one of citing Anhaya here, so it's not just me feeling, but I think innovation is one of the key crucial things that philanthropy can do in society. Government is slow implementing changes. Corporations won't do a lot of changes, but philanthropy can move fast and they can take risks with the money they have, and they can really implement big social changes or changes focused on environmental policies, if you don't want to talk about social changes. But people don't really understand that is one of the key functions. That's what philanthropy could do. And I think another really big problem, at least in the weird countries, is that the funding organizations are led by a very uniform group of people, mostly white older men. And there's often no one with lived experience on the issues on boards or involved in the decision making. And I really think we need to change that. I think we need to diversify who decides on philanthropy so that the voices who it's all about are included in those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the just on the question of trying to actively sort of encourage more philanthropy and develop cultures of philanthropy, we mentioned before about policymaking as a mechanism, and I guess we've been talking, mostly about research and kind of academic understanding as a way of driving that. I guess there's another bit potentially which is just the direct funding from within the non-profit world or the philanthropy world itself. And I wondered whether you had seen any good examples or thought that there was potential for philanthropic funders and foundations who are interested in this idea of broadening out our understanding of generosity and developing a global culture of generosity to directly fund initiatives to build cultures of giving in other places. I guess because it feels as though when we've talked about developing philanthropy in quote unquote emerging markets or the global south in the past, too often it feels as though what we've been talking about is how do we import money from other places, and so it's very much kind of giving from the global north to the global south. But actually, is there more that could be done to think about developing domestic cultures of giving in lots of different places that more clearly reflect their own histories and cultures? And could funders from the global north do something meaningful there by providing the infrastructure and the funding for that?
Yeah, I think Giving Tuesday is a great example of doing this, but I think we need much more than just the Giving Tuesday movement. And this question I always find hard to answer, what philanthropic funders from the global north could do, because I don't have a lot of experience with this, and I think it's really important to talk to people about this that have that experience, because so much can go wrong, and it does go wrong, I think. But if I had to give an answer, I think it's very tricky. And funders need to be aware of the power issues and power differences, and be willing to give up part of their power and to let those initiatives be local led and give the power on decision making away to the people that are actually in the context.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It feels like an area in which there would be a significant risk of even well-meaning funders coming in and just because of their scale doing unintended harm. So it would need to be done carefully. I'm aware that we're coming up on the hour that I said I was going to take up your time, so I won't keep you for much longer. I just wanted to ask, whether there are any particular things that you're working on at the moment that you're excited about, or things that you wanted to let people know about particularly.
Yes, together with Famida Handy, we're editing a new volume commissioned by Edgar Elgar, and we're looking for contributors who want to write a chapter. We have a flyer. Please email me if you have interest in this. And this book is about philanthropy, key topics, and contending perspectives. And it can be in the broadest sense, and we're looking especially for contributors from underrepresented countries, but also contributors from the weird countries. And I'm excited about this project because we will get to work with people that are working on like the key issues in philanthropy right now and learn a lot from that process. And another project I'm super scared about, but I really want to do this because I think it will help me contribute to my mission of creating more generous societies, is trying to develop a theory. And I'm not going to say grand theory because I think that's also a lot of issues with that terminology. But I want to create a theory of global generosity, and by working back from evolutionary biology and bringing in all these different ideas from different disciplines, trying to understand why people behave to benefit others.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating and definitely something that I'm going to get you back on the podcast in future to talk in depth about. Just remains to say thanks ever so much, Pamela, for coming on the podcast. I will put links in the show notes to lots of things that we've talked about and places where people can find out about your work and get in touch with you if they're interested in contributing to the volume that you mentioned. But I certainly wish you all the best and hopefully speak in the not too distant future.
Thanks so much for having me on this podcast. It was such a pleasure to talk about this topic that is really important to me.
Okay, brilliant. Well, my thanks again to Pamela for coming on the podcast. Absolutely lovely to have a chance to sit down and talk to her about all the really fascinating work that she's doing. I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can find more information on the work we discussed, and certainly on where you can find out about the edited volume that Pamela mentioned at the end. And if you're interested in getting involved in that and submitting a proposal for a chapter, obviously that would be absolutely brilliant. And I'll put information about where you can do that. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, obviously always check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. There's absolutely tons of content on there now. I've just put up a pretty big article all about philanthropy and sport and activism. So if you're interested in that in this summer of sport, then do check that out. You can also find all the back editions of the podcast there. You can find lots of news updates. Can find all of the back issues of the newsletter that I put out every month. You can sign up for that newsletter. Basically, you could just fill all of your days for most of the summer just hanging out on that website, and that would be great from an analytics point of view for me. So if you want to do that, that would be lovely. On which note, if you like the podcast, please do give us a good review at iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. I think that would really help to kind of drive us up charts, and I understand from listening to other podcasts that that's a good thing. On a more human level, if you like it, and other people that you think might like it, just tell them and get them to listen. What's the worst that could happen? If you want to follow me for any reason on social media, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can still just about find me on Twitter or X, although, as I've said many times, I'm not really doing very much on there anymore. But other than that, I hope you all have a great summer. As I say, I'm taking a break for a few weeks over the majority of August. We'll be back in September with more great episodes. If you have thoughts on any topics that you think would be particularly good to cover in some of those episodes, do drop me a line. You can find the contact details at the Why Philanthropy Matters website, or if you think there are people that you'd love to hear me interview, again, let me know, and either set me up with them or I can try and sort that out for myself. Other than that, like, subscribe, tell all your friends about it, have yourselves a great break over the summer, and I will see you in September. Bye!